We're back now with the latest on the biggest banking collapse since the 2008 financial crisis.
That's right. Weeks after federal regulators took over Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank, the Senate Banking Committee is expected to hold the first hearing on the collapse today. For more on what we can expect, we're joined by NBC News business and data reporter Brian Cheung. Brian, good morning. So who are we expecting to hear from? What's the focus, and what are you looking for?
Yes, there's going to be three folks testifying on Capitol Hill this morning. It's going to be one representative from the U.S. Treasury, one representative from the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and one representative from the Federal Reserve that will be testifying about the spectacular collapse of those two banks about 2 weeks ago, Signature Bank and also Silicon Valley Bank. What exactly happened there? How did regulators not catch the issues that were happening at those banks? And what are the steps forward? We know that both those banks now have new owners, at least in part. But does that mean that the bleeding has stopped in the banking sector? We'll have to hear from those government officials to see whether or not they have any sort of extra insight into the situation with the banks and whether or not people are still worried and taking their money out of the banking system.
You mentioned new owners. This hearing comes after it was announced yesterday First Citizens Bank purchased 17 Silicon Valley Bank branches. What should customers of both of those banks know? Any reason for concern at all here?
Yeah, so the news hitting late on Sunday that First Citizens, which is based in Raleigh, North Carolina, will be buying part, not all of the assets of Silicon Valley Bank, that large bank that failed out in San Francisco. Now, for what it's worth, those customers who are largely small businesses, medium-sized businesses, tech companies, private equity, venture capital, they are all now customers effectively of First Citizens. Now, it's interesting because Silicon Valley Bank was actually double the size of First Citizens at the end of last year. But what happens when a bank ends up collapsing is that the assets become a lot less valuable. So the FDIC, the government that took ownership of it, ultimately sold it at a massive discount to this other bank. But again, it just shows signs, though, that there are buyers in this market and that it's good because the government ultimately didn't have to hold the hot potato into perpetuity.
That's a good way to say it. And Brian, I know the House Financial Services Committee is expected to hold a bipartisan meeting tomorrow. We also know that we're going to hear testimony from Barr and Gruenberg testifying again, though we've heard from Janet Yellen saying the government will not bail out these banks again. So what should we be looking for there?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, Michael Barr from the Federal Reserve and then Martin Gruenberg from the FDIC, they're going to talk about the regulatory side of things, what exactly unfolded in the ownership and the collapse of those two banks that failed. But we're going to listen very closely from the Treasury on the political side of things. Nellie Liang is going to be representing the Treasury. It's not going to be Yellen on the stand today. And then, as you mentioned, tomorrow on the House Financial Services Committee. But as Janet Yellen has said, what average Americans are worried about that don't have money at either of those banks is, well, did any of my taxpayer money go into bailing out those two banks? And the answer so far has been no, because the money that was used to essentially buy up those banks and take care of them in the interim was done using the Deposit Insurance Fund, which is made up of fees that the regulators assess on the banks themselves. So up to date, there's been no congressional legislation or anything that impacts our individual taxpayer dollars. But there are questions if they need to replenish that fund by putting more fees back onto the banks. Do the banks pass on those costs to customers later on in the future? That actually could be an indirect way that we'll all pay for this. But again, a little bit too early to say.
Oh, boy, everyone's watching, including our wallets. We're feeling it.
Right.
So, Brian Cheung, thank you so much.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.